of our series, Covenant and Kingdom. Last week we really defined and dug into the idea of covenant. That covenant, well, it's not a word that we use so much, but what we kind of want to equate it to is relationship. Covenant is relationship. Today we're defining and looking into kingdom. And if you were to define that, if covenant is relationship, then kingdom is, anybody remember from last week? Responsibility. Excellent. Covenant is relationship. Kingdom is responsibility. And what we learned in the idea of covenant is that really, God has instilled in us, we learned this through the story of Abraham and how he called him to be his own son. He's instilled in us a different identity than the world wants to give us. At work, you might be known as successful, you might be unsuccessful, and that might shape your identity. In school, you might be a good student, good listener, bad listener. Could be straight A's or struggling to make it. Those things affect your identity, don't they? In your neighborhood, you could be this, you could be that. In your families, you could be known as this or that. Identity is shaped by so many different things. But if our identity is not first and foremost rooted in who we are because of Jesus, sons and daughters of the Father, then we might as well not even go on with the series. We might as well not talk about kingdom, because everything, even the responsibilities that God's called us to, they're meaningless if they don't first come from a place of identity. Square one, the most necessary foundational building block for us is our identity. When you've been baptized into the family of God, you've been made a child, a son, a daughter of the Father, and you are His. That means that everything that is yours is His, and everything that is His is yours. For some of you, you've never been told that before. In fact, the identity that you have of God is an identity of a judgmental, far-off, distant, finger-pointing, disappointed God. And yet the God of the Bible that we see is a God of intimate relationship that longs to be in such a close relationship with us that He would call us His sons and daughters. Very different identity. So we use that, our identity as sons and daughters, today as a springboard into talking about kingdom or our responsibilities. And that's where we find ourselves in the story of Joseph. So go ahead and take a look at chapter 37. We're just going to kind of zip through a couple of these chapters, and we're going to see the journey of Joseph, this story of how God uses him to be responsible in showing His reign, His rule, His lordship over all of creation. And it really is a transformation, and you'll see why in just a minute. Take a look at chapter 37. We're not going to really read this out loud or anything, but I want you to catch a drift of what's going on here. Joseph is the youngest of all the brothers. Anybody have a younger brother, younger sister? Yeah? Do they ever get jealous of you, or maybe you get jealous of them ever? Or were you old enough when they were born that when they came into the world, doggone, they stole all the spotlight, didn't they? And nobody wanted to see you anymore. They all wanted to see little brother, little sister, right? Such a lame idea. All the attention should be on the oldest child. Anybody else an oldest child? I'm an oldest child. We love the attention. Keep the spotlight on us. Absolutely. We're the firstborn. We're paving the way for all of our family, right? The spotlight should be on us. And so when little brother, little sister comes along, they steal our spotlight. As older sibling, you're probably not feeling all that great about that. You're getting a little jealous about it, aren't you? That's exactly what happens to Joseph here. In fact, you'll see that Joseph starts having dreams. And in all these dreams, look at who is at the center of them. Look at verse 5. Actually, let's back up and go to verse 3. Now Israel, or Jacob, his father, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Not good parenting 101, moms and dads. Okay? Because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him. Here's the Technicolor Dreamcoat. When his brothers saw that their father loved Joseph more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Verse 5, Joseph had a dream, and when he had told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Who's at the center here? Joseph, right? Joseph is at the center, and his brothers are around him, bowing down to him. So his brothers say in verse 8, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he'd said. So Joseph, still not quite sure what to do with the spotlight, and probably pretty excited that the spotlight is on him, that his father loves him more than anybody else, probably enjoying this a little bit too much, says, hey guys, got another dream. Got another dream. Let me tell you about it. Look at verse 9. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. So you think the sheaves of grain were pretty impressive. Now the whole universe is bowing down to me. Who's at the center of this one? You guys awake? Who's at the center of this one? Joseph is. He's at the center of this again. Now, go back to the older brother, older sister mentality. If this is happening, your brother's already taken the favored spot from your dad. And now he starts giving me these dreams that he's been having, that all of you are about to bow down to him, that all of you are going to be under his authority. How you feeling right now? Probably not so good, right? A little jealous, a little bit of hatred. That's why it says in here, their hatred for him grew even more and more. Joseph is loving this. But then things start to change a little bit. Look on in verse 37. You can see by the subtitle. Does your Bible have subtitles? You see the subtitle? Mine says, Joseph sold by his brothers. That is a dramatic change in the plot. Joseph is now not any longer in the center of all things, but instead his brothers have conspired to kill him. One brother says, let's not kill him. Let's just lose him somewhere. Let's beat him up a little bit and toss him in a well. So they do that. They beat him up, toss him in the well. They take his Technicolor dream coat. They smear blood on it, go back and tell Dad that he's been killed by a wild beast. Meanwhile, Joseph's uncle, what a terrible uncle, finds him there and says, I'm going to take him as my slave. Can you imagine if your uncle did that to you? What kind of family is that? But this is one of those crazy uncles. We all have a crazy uncle, right? So crazy uncle comes along and says, I'm going to take you as my slave. They take him, and now Joseph, as their slave, has been sold off to Potiphar. Now Potiphar, if you're reading on, you can skip over to chapter 39 now. Potiphar is a high-ranking official. In fact, he's kind of the head of security for all of the Pharaoh in Egypt. Very close to the most powerful position in the whole world at that time. Egypt, mega power in all of the world. And here, Joseph's been sold to one of their key leaders. And so while he's there, Joseph starts serving around Potiphar's house. And maybe you're familiar with the story, but Joseph is serving. He's doing exactly what God's called him to do. He's serving faithfully. He's submitting to that leadership. Although you might want to rebel and try to escape, Joseph is there and he starts to serve. And he serves faithfully until one day, Potiphar's wife thinks it'd be a good idea to take advantage of him. So she shows up on the scene naked, trying to seduce him. Several times she tries to seduce him. Comes to the point now where Joseph has to fight this temptation. This is a serious temptation. Notice how Joseph handles this too. And for anyone facing any kind of temptation, but especially if you're facing any kind of sexual temptation, if you can't get in the fight and fight it well, then you should probably run from the fight before you get in it. So what Joseph does is before Potiphar's wife is even able to get close, he runs. So Potiphar's wife, not pleased with Joseph, accuses him of raping her. Potiphar's wife has probably done this several times. You could read through this and see this in chapter 39. But Potiphar's wife has probably done this several times now because her husband, Potiphar, doesn't really believe her. Because if he did believe her, then Joseph would be killed for sure. He'd be stoned, spiked, thrown off a cliff, something, beheaded, whatever it might have been. He would have been done for sure. But because Potiphar's pretty sure that he didn't do this, he just throws him in jail. And remember, he's head over security, so he has access to this jail cell where Joseph is. So Joseph, even though he's still in jail, is able to serve faithfully both the Pharaoh, the people that are in the prison with him, and he's still able to communicate with Potiphar. What's interesting about that is in here, Joseph interprets some dreams. In fact, becomes so good at it and becomes so well known for doing this that Pharaoh starts calling him into his chambers saying, I had this dream last night, what does it mean? It's really interesting that God will give us opportunities to serve when we're in places that we don't want to be. Have you ever had that? Joseph, the guy in the spotlight. Everyone was bowing down to him. It's pretty easy to serve in that spot, isn't it? It's pretty easy to have a pretty good spirit about things, to have a good attitude toward things, to be joyful about things. But you get thrown in prison. You get accused of raping Potiphar's wife. Usually not the easiest place to serve, is it? And yet Joseph, even though things are not quite what they were when he was at the center, now he's still serving faithfully. And so Joseph goes on to interpret these dreams. He interprets one of Pharaoh's dreams all the way to the point now where we get to chapter 42. Joseph's brothers, because there's been a famine in the land, right? And that was one of the dreams that Joseph interpreted for Pharaoh. He said there's going to be 7 years of great profit, great abundant resources. You should store up for all that because there's going to be 7 years of famine. So you should be preparing for that. He does during the famine. Now Joseph's brothers show up in Egypt, and by this time, Joseph is in a powerful position. In fact, he's now in charge of all of Egypt himself. His brothers show up. They have to submit to his leadership. But before that even happens, when Pharaoh comes to Joseph and says, I want you to interpret my dreams, it's very interesting what Joseph says to him. Look at chapter 41, verse 15. Pharaoh says to Joseph, I had a dream. No one else can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now, here comes Joseph, the guy who used to be in the center of everything with everyone bowing down around him, the guy who was the favorite son with the Technicolor Dreamcoat, the guy who was the favorite of all the brothers, even though he was the youngest. The guy who's used to saying, I can do that, I'll step up and lead, I'll be in the spotlight, now says this in verse 16 in response to Pharaoh. He says, I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Isn't it interesting how God brings Joseph along this journey to come from the favorite of all the sons, even though he's the youngest, to have dreams of people bowing down to him and being in authority, to a place where he is sold into slavery, serves as accused of rape, spends time in prison, and now is brought back into the most powerful position in the world. In each of those three settings, God calls Joseph to represent him well, to be faithful in serving well. Even when he's the favorite, even when he's in prison, even when he's in a position of great leadership. But do you notice how it transforms? It transforms, Joseph is transformed from being the guy who's used to being in the spotlight and saying, I can do it, to now being completely out of the center of everything. Even though he has all of the leadership now, all the power, all the authority, he now says, I can't interpret the dream, but God has something to say for you. See, somewhere in this relationship between covenant and kingdom, between our identity and our responsibility, is the question, how do we go about representing God well in our city? If covenant is our relationship and identity because of Jesus with God, then kingdom is our responsibility to show this city and our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, this world, just how good God is. The only way you can do that is, first, it comes from a place of identity. But secondly, the only way that it can be done is if, just like Joseph was taken out of the center and God put into the center, is if you are taken out of the center of your life, if life stops revolving around you, your desires, your spotlight, you kind of drift to the edge, the margins, and you say, God, I want you in the center of this. Just like we heard Joseph say to Pharaoh, I can't do it, but I have a God who can. I guarantee you, if you're like me, what you want to do is you want to try harder to be a better person. You want to try harder to serve the city better. You want to try harder to be a better leader, to be a better communicator. You want to try harder to be a better fiance. You want to be a better husband, a better wife. You want to be a better son, a better daughter. And the way that we get there, at least how we think about it, is that if we try harder, if we make it a bigger priority, if we set it higher on the to-do list, if we're more focused on it, then we'll get there. In fact, I'm pretty sure the reason why we're tired and the reason why each one of us raised our hand to saying, I'm busy, is because we've bought into thinking that the harder we try, the closer we'll get to achieving it. When really, God's calling us to first remember our identity, that no matter what, no matter where you've been, no matter what your past looks like, no matter how hard you've tried or haven't tried, because of Jesus, you are his son, you are his daughter. And when that identity starts to take shape in our lives, we start to notice that life doesn't revolve around us anymore, but that life begins to revolve around God, around how he's working in our lives, and how he wants to work in our city through us. Trying to serve the city, trying to be responsible, trying to live in such a way that reveals how good God is to our city, to our neighbors, cannot be done apart from our identity as sons and daughters. If I asked you to show me what it looks like to be a son of my dad, Jock Ficken, if I asked you to show me what that looked like, would you be able to do that? Would you be able to do it well? No. Just like if you asked me to try and model what it looks like to be your parent's son or your parent's daughter, I couldn't do it because I'm not their son. You're not my dad's son or my dad's daughter. You don't know what that relationship looks like. You haven't experienced it. You haven't taken on the identity of his son or his daughter. So how can you be expected to reveal that to anybody else? How would anybody else know who your parents are if you weren't able to model for them what it looks like to be their son, their daughter? The same is true with our Father in heaven. How can we tell people how good the good news is of Jesus if we're not encountering it in our lives every day. So here's my question for you. If God's calling us to serve this city, then what lie is it that you're believing that disqualifies you from being God's son or God's daughter? Because I'm so convinced that sharing the good news of Jesus, serving our city, loving homeless people, wealthy people, poor people, business people, blue-collar people, whatever you want to say. If we're going to serve anybody, it starts with our identity in Christ. And it continues with life not circling around us, but around what God's doing in us. So this morning, just want to create some space for you to respond to that, to listen to that. In fact, band, if you guys want to come back up, this is how we're going to do that this morning. There's a word board. That's that big black board back there with neon marker on it and stuff. We encourage you during this time, go back and write down something that God is either inviting you into. Maybe He's calling you to hear His voice and hear the identity that He has for you. Maybe you want to write down a word of challenge, that God has called you to love your neighborhood in a certain way. And I want to invite you to write that word down on the board back there. During this time, this is just very free-flowing, and you're not expected to sit up, stand up, sit down, whatever. You can just be. Be His son, be His daughter. Maybe you want to fill out the connection card and write down a prayer that God's placing on your heart. Maybe you want to listen to these words. Maybe you want to sing at the top of your lungs. But my encouragement to you is respond to what it is that God is doing in your life this morning. So let me pray for us.